Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the Russian-Ukrainian war. Joe Biden has departed Ukraine, and we have heard the the Vladimir Putin State of the Union address, or the equivalent of that speech, and obviously that addressed the ongoing war that is taking place in Ukraine. It again explained the Russian position. You may not agree with the Russian position. You may look at this conflict in terms of black and white, which it is not. It is far from black and white. It is far from just what the mainstream media narrative of this Russian invasion of Ukraine actually is. And I think he did a reasonable job in explaining the Russian side of what's happening. Obviously, the West will have to delve into history, and that doesn't happen much here in the United States. At least the average person who is stuck on popular culture and who is fixated with mainstream news, and in some cases, some of those folks take that as gospel, and much of it is simply untrue. But again, we heard it again, the reason behind this Russian operation. At the same time, he addressed current and ongoing social issues that are occurring here in the United States and other Western nation states. Specifically, it was in regards to transgenderism, homosexuality, and the degrading of morals and values in Western nation states. And obviously, that was a tactic designed to fracture and splinter the two political parties here in the United States. And I think it was effective because part of it, well, what he said is true. There is a movement to defy natural law. And that's being constantly done through debauchery and other issues as well here in the United States, and especially this perverse fixation on transgenderism and what you identify as, and clever to insert that into his speech. At the same time, he discussed the war in Ukraine, and clearly, obviously, he has in his inner circle has no intent at all to end the war. And as he discussed about the $150 billion in military aid, he discussed the fact that longer range systems were going to be deployed to and given and handed over to the Ukrainians, and that would cause the Russian military to continue to push what it believes is a Western threat to his nation further back. And that means attempting to take control of additional Ukrainian territory. But what is glaringly apparent, there is no end in sight to this conflict. And what I think is interesting, if we go back in history and we go back to, say, the Syrian Civil War, and here in the United States, most people don't even look back that far in terms of some of the comments, some of the speeches that Obama made in regards to Bashar al-Assad and the current Syrian government. But as the Syrian Civil War raged, here in the United States, it was taken as absolute fact that at some point the regime of Assad would collapse and another government, another entity would take shape and take form and take power inside of Syria. It was absolute that was going to happen. it did not happen. Currently, here in the United States, most people who watch mainstream media news have this perception that eventually the West is going to win in Ukraine, that they may cause the Russians so many battlefield losses and then quite possibly some sort of counteroffensive by the Ukrainians that will military defeat the Russians in the military domain. There's also a thought process that the Ukrainians are going to retake the Crimean Peninsula. That is never going to happen. The Russians will use nuclear weapons before they allow the Crimean Peninsula to come under the control of the Zelensky government or whatever government exists after Zelensky leaves, if he leaves. Not going to happen. It's highly unlikely that the Ukrainians will achieve any sort of battlefield success that would eliminate the land corridor running from Donetsk down to through Melitopol and into Crimea. This area here. Highly unlikely. Probably more likely than a successful effort to retake the Crimea, but nonetheless, highly, highly unlikely, especially as the war continues. I've talked about this before, how the Russian mobilization continues. Again, the worst is probably behind the Russians right now in terms of battlefield setbacks. Right now, we're seeing the Russian military start to repair itself, change certain aspects of its doctrine, make those modifications both at a tactical and strategic level. Is it perfect yet? Have they overcome all military challenges that they're seeing right now? No, absolutely not. But they are improving. And the Ukrainians continue to take very large numbers of casualties, quite possibly more casualties than what the Russians are taking. And I say this because the Russians have the ability to strike deeper into Ukraine. They have more artillery. They have more longer range multiple launch rocket system. Obviously, the Ukrainians do have their own systems. They do have a certain amount of HIMARS and other longer range systems as well, but not in the numbers that the Russians have. And the Russians right now are using that qualitative edge against the Ukrainians, and that's going to continue. And I believe there is this thought that the war could end this year. There could be some sort of arrangement. There could be some sort of peace agreement. While possible, I would say unlikely. Based on that speech by Vladimir Putin that I watched, it's very apparent that the Russians cannot stop the war with its current battlefield objectives that it has obtained. This area here, most of Luhansk, most of Donetsk, much of Kherson, Zaporizhia, based on what's going to happen post-war. And what's going to happen post-war is going to be the rearmament of the Ukrainian state. So if there were to be some sort of peaceful settlement where the status quo is accepted by both parties, let's say the Russians walk away with an agreement and they get to keep everything that they currently have, which right now is unacceptable to the Ukrainians. But if that were to happen, and if the Ukrainians were to capitulate the current territory that they have lost, the rearmament efforts by the Ukrainians is going to be unprecedented. You may not see the Ukrainians join NATO, but they will become de facto NATO. They will rearm on a level, again, the likes of which we have not seen in Western Europe. And eventually, you're probably looking at a capability that the Ukrainians would have, especially in regards to air power. If there was some sort of ceasefire, if the Russians were no longer conducting military operations, if the Ukrainians controlled what they have now, the Russians know perfectly well that the Ukrainians would be handed over an air force. And within 5 years, they would have a much more advanced air force, chock full of Western weapons, if that's F-16s, if it's Typhoons, if it's Rafales, if it is some other Western fighter jet. They're going to have them. And it's going to be a much more vast improvement than the Air Force that they had at the start of this conflict. The army, the Ukrainian army, is going to receive huge amounts of infusions of more Western military equipment, including maneuver forces. And the Russians know that. And that would put them in a position much more dire than the position that they faced when they launched their invasion last year. So right now, I believe, at least, on the surface, the Russians are changing their military goals. They are in this for the long haul. They are most likely in this, at this point, if they can get away with it, the seizure of all territory east of the Dnieper River. And again, that's based on their thought process of, if the conflict ends today, what does our adversary, Ukraine, look like 5 years from now? And that's what has them concerned. They have no breakwater. They have no ability, under the current amounts of territory that they control, to be able to mount an adequate defense possibly 5 years from now, outside the use of tactical nuclear weapons, if the West fully rearms Ukraine. And that means, again, giving them an air force, and then at the same time, any future military conflict would be even that much more expensive even than the conflict we're seeing now. Because, again, the Ukrainians would have an air force. Now, that is why I believe right now we're seeing the Russians prepare for this spring, late summer operation that's going to be designed to continue to prosecute the war until they have seized all territory east of the Dnieper River. I think right now they don't have an option. I don't think the Russian leadership, the Russian inner circle, sees any other option at this point. Again, they stopped the war, status quo. What does the Ukrainian military look like in 5 years? And I would think that the Russian general staff is communicating to the Kremlin, to Putin, to Putin's inner circle, that, look, we stop this war now, it's going to be much, much worse in terms of if there is another military conflict. And this would essentially be a frozen military conflict until the Ukrainians are able to rearm and reassert themselves. And I have no doubt that that would probably end up happening, because the Russians are looking further into the future. They have to ask themselves, what does the Ukrainian government look like 5-10 years from now? Does a more nationalistic government take power inside of Ukraine that seeks even further militarization? Possibly. I would say it's more likely than not unlikely. And that's the Russian concern. And that's why I believe they're going to continue this war until they get some sort of capitulation from the Ukrainians. At the same time, you see these peace overtures from the Chinese. I'm not sure that's a peace overture. I think the Chinese are doing what they need to do to eventually have the ability to send the Russians lethal weapons. I think what we're seeing right now with the Chinese is a facade designed to create the perception that, hey, we tried to seek a peaceful outcome of this conflict, and we were unable to do that. And since we were unable to do that, since the West didn't listen to us, well, now we are going to do what the West is doing. We're going to hand over weapon systems to our allies, the Russians. And I think that's what's going to happen. I think we're already starting to see that. I think the Russians are now sourcing various equipment that is much needed by the Russian military infrastructure, and I think that's being handed over. And the Chinese can call that non-lethal equipment. If the Russians need optical equipment or equipment designed to manufacture thermal imaging sites, well, that's non-lethal. It eventually becomes lethal, but those components are not lethal that the Chinese hand over. And then eventually, I would anticipate that we will start to see Chinese weapon systems on the field being fielded by the Russians. The Chinese have made great strides in developing weapons, drones, precision-guided bombs and missiles, and we'll probably see them being deployed by the Russians at some point. But this is not going to end, and it's only getting worse. All the nuclear treaties have now been abandoned. All the nuclear treaties that came into effect during the Reagan administration, Carter administration, all those are gone. They don't exist anymore. There are essentially no more nuclear treaties between Russia and the United States. It should concern you, but you're not going to hear much about that. Not going to hear much about that at all. But that's where we set for today. We will have more very, very soon. Thank you for joining us today. And as always, have a good day.